Creepypastas need no introduction. To sum them up for those of you who somehow don't know what they are, creepypasta are internet scary stories which are made to be copied and pasted around the web, basically serving as the internet's version of a campfire story or urban legend. Now, I've already discussed many of the most popular classic creepypastas, so I want to do something a little different tonight. I want to talk about games that don't exist, or rather, creepypastas about games that don't exist. While there's countless creepypasta about haunted or otherwise modified versions of existing games, there's far less about games that otherwise do not exist. And that's exactly what I want to talk about tonight. Gaming creepypastas about games that aren't based on any existing IP, just based on the pure imagination of the author. Of course, these stories I'll be talking about have clear real-world inspirations, but they aren't as simple as taking a pre-existing game and slapping hyper-realistic blood on it. Now, with the popularity of these creepypastas, replicas and recreations were bound to follow. So, remember, when I say these games don't exist, I mean in their original forms, described by the stories. I'll be talking about a few of these creepypastas tonight, ranging from various levels of obscurity, though there is a decent chance you've heard of all of these stories before. Like last time, I'll be summarizing each story, then I'll go over my thoughts, and finally, I'll talk about if I think it's aged well. Who knows? Maybe these will hold up better than the gaming creepypastas I talked about last time. Not that that's a high bar. Before we begin, if you end up enjoying this video, please do consider leaving a like and subscribing. It really helps me out. If this video does well, I might make more smaller creepypasta videos like this. So, really, I mean it when I say liking helps me out. But without further ado, let's dive right into the first story. Starting off, we have possibly the most famous creepypasta about a fake video game. Polybius. I've talked about this one before in my childhood trauma video, but I think it would be a disservice if I didn't go over it again here. Now, as for the story itself, Polybius is a supposedly lost arcade game said to have originated in Portland, Oregon during the year 1981, and quickly, it became extremely popular in the arcades which housed it. So popular, in fact, that people became addicted to it, and many people suffered harmful side effects, such as amnesia, insomnia, nightmares, and in some cases, people took their own life after playing the game. This, in and of itself, is strange, but what makes things weirder is that men in black suits would come extract data from the machines every so often, possibly collecting data for the US government. That little summary I just gave you is basically the entire original story, though an alternate version provides a bit more detail. This version says that Polybius was developed by a German company known as Misfortune.gb, which roughly translates to Sense Delete, a very strange name for a video game developer to have. This version of the story also adds some more side effects, such as nausea, seizures, and hallucinations. Among the previously mentioned side effects, after 1 month, Polybius vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. And that's all of the extra details that can be added to Polybius. The game's developer, some more side effects, and the game vanishing after a month. Strangely though, no details about the game itself. Some versions of the story say that it used vector graphics, and that it was a shooter, not unlike Asteroids or Galaga, but these details aren't present in many versions of the story. Since Polybius is so vague, I don't have much more to say about it. It's in all honesty, pretty realistic by creepypasta standards, with the only truly unrealistic parts being the more extreme side effects and the whole Men in Black thing. Polybius seems to be inspired by various incidents at arcades in the 80s, where people either experienced various health complications or tragically lost their life. The most famous example being the game Berserk, with at least one person having a fatal heart attack after playing the game. These incidents, of course, were not the fault of the games themselves, but rather people not taking care of themselves while playing or already having health conditions. There's also the government aspect of the story, which many people interpret as being similar to MK Ultra, but who knows if that was the original intention of the story or not. So with all of that said, I suppose Polybius has aged well. It's truly a mystery where this story came from, and if it's based in reality or not. Who knows? Maybe Polybius is out there, waiting for us to find it. Along with Polybius, these next two creepypastas I'm going to be talking about were what gave me the idea for this video. However, this one is a lot more obscure. It's entirely possible you've heard of the theater before, since it's not an extremely obscure creepypasta, but I hardly ever hear it talked about. I consider it to be a classic, and I think by classic creepypasta standards, it's not bad at all. The Theater is a supposed PC game released sometime in the early 90s, going off of it being released around the same time as Doom. The game was infamous for being nearly impossible to get working, as the only copies were on bootleg CD-ROMs, and the game would often fail to install correctly, freezing on either the license agreement, which lacks any developer name, or the install screen. Should you somehow get it working, the entire game consists of the player walking forward and talking to an NPC, the ticket taker, who when interacted with, produces a low quality sound saying, "Thank you. Please enjoy the movie." Heading forward, the screen fades to black, and the cycle continues. It's worth noting that this might be because of how poorly made the game is, as the menu options aside from New Game don't work. Selecting Options crashes the game, and selecting Load, even if you do have a save file, doesn't work. So, really, who knows if this infinite loop is meant to be part of the game? Eventually, after an unknown amount of loops, the ticket taker will disappear, and the player can now head further down the hallway without the gameplay looping. And what they find at the end of the hallway is the ticket taker with a swirl for a face. This is the aptly named Swirly Head Man, who is said to produce a low quality screech before the game glitches out. After a few minutes, the player returns to the lobby, with the ticket taker now seemingly worried. For the rest of the game, the Swirly Head Man will periodically appear, disappearing when the player looks at him. After a few more loops, the ticket taker will begin to pace around with a worried expression. Nobody knows for sure what he says due to the low quality voice clip, but it's agreed by many that he says something along the lines of, "Never reach the other levels." The creepypasta continues by saying that nobody knows how to access the other levels, and that nobody knows what they could contain. All copies of the theater have either been destroyed or lost, and those who have played it in the past claim to occasionally see the Swirly Head Man in the corners of their vision. I'm going to be honest, I really don't think this is that bad. Does the theater use a lot of gaming creepypasta tropes? Absolutely, but it uses them in a much more interesting way than most creepypastas. The strangeness of the theater, as in the game, is both due to its lack of polish and the possible haunted nature of the game. Who knows? Maybe the Swirly Head Man isn't a ghost, and the people who claim to have seen him are just hallucinating. I genuinely think there's a really good base for a story here, and honestly, of all of the games I'm going to talk about, this is the most plausible sounding game, either as a genuine 90s game that was shoddily made, or as an actual horror game taking inspiration from the creepypasta. Before we continue, I do want to briefly mention the sequel, The True Story of the Theater, which expands upon the original story quite a bit. as it details some of the other levels mentioned, and it actually does a fantastic
Say that again?
job of making this game feel real. I think that's in no small part because these two stories are written less like creepypastas and more like reviews of the game, though the true story of the theater removes a lot of the possible paranormal aspects. If there's anything to be learned from the theater, it's that a story about a weird, buggy, unfinished game is a lot more interesting than a generic story about a haunted game that kills you. Similar to Polybius, this one feels plausible, and that's not something I can say about the next creepypasta I'll be taking a look at. Mr. Mix is one of the first creepypastas I thought of when I started working on this video. Even though it's not great. It suffers from a lot of the usual issues of gaming creepypastas, but unlike those, I do think there is a good concept here. Unfortunately though, I don't think there's really any way to use that concept effectively. The story itself is about a mysterious 1990s PC game, the titular Mr. Mix, which, of course, has a dark secret to it. Mr. Mix is a typing game, compared to Mario Teaches typing in the story, though it had a high difficulty curve, with the first level only requiring the player to reach 10 words per minute, and the impossible 5th level requiring 500 words per minute. Let me put this in perspective for you. I'm a pretty fast typer, always have been, and I can, at best, reach around 90 words per minute. 90 words per minute is fast, really fast. According to several sources, the average person has a typing speed of around 40 words per minute, and I typically range around 60 to 70 words per minute. Now I don't mean for this to come off as bragging, at all. I just want you to know how fucking absurd 500 words per minute is. I mean, I don't even know if that's humanly possible. The absurd words per minute requirement wasn't the strangest part of the game though. No, that would be the music. Though calling it that is a bit of a stretch. The first level's music is an unsettling pattern of growls that got progressively louder as the level went on, often causing damage to early computer speakers that were not designed to handle extremely high volumes. Level 2 has no music, but level 3 has what sounded like a very low quality recording of a hairdryer playing in the background. The remaining 2 levels' music was an incredibly loud high-pitched ringing that caused severe eardrum damage to those who managed to get that far. Okay, now this is where Mr. Mix starts to fall apart. The premise is honestly not bad, as I can definitely see there being a strange, obscure 90s game that was unintentionally terrifying to children, but the music is just creepy sounds that either damage your hearing or your speakers? Why the hell would that be in what's supposedly a children's game? See, that kind of thing makes more sense in creepypastas about haunted or hacked games, because those are, in universe, meant to be scaring the player. But we're led to believe Mr. Mix is a regular, albeit unintentionally horrifying, children's game. But I digress. Let's continue with the story. As I already mentioned, level 5 is basically impossible, requiring you to type 500 words in a single minute. However, a group of hackers managed to get past this impossible 5th level, and doing so caused the game to crash and write a bunch of files to the user's System32 directory to the point that the RAM is almost completely filled. What? Now, I'm no computer expert, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's not how System32 works. The files themselves are, of course, deformed screaming faces with missing skin and bleeding eyes, so not too unusual for a creepypasta, and deleting these files causes your computer to brick itself. That's right, deleting these images just completely breaks your PC. honestly, I shouldn't even be surprised at this point. The hackers managed to find a lone byte, which, when deleted, allows them to access the final level. But of course, the level is too scary, so they don't want to reveal what happens. What you're seeing on screen right now is the interpretation from the video Mr. Mix Gameplay, uploaded by Subject 1. I don't know if this is the creator of the video or not, but either way, that's who uploaded it. All of the hackers who viewed the final level of Mr. Mix went insane, being unable to speak coherent sentences within a week, and vanishing within a month. All copies of the game were destroyed, and 2 years after the hackers accessed the final level of Mr. Mix, one of the hackers was found. He had been arrested for trying to kidnap an 8-year-old boy at a grocery store, and when questioned, all he said was, "I'm Mr. Mix." And that is the story of Mr. Mix. I was not kidding when I said it was bad. Again, I do think there's a good idea here, but the execution falls flat. Unfortunately though, there's not much you could do to really fix it without completely changing the story. The only part of Mr. Mix that, in my opinion, actually works is the concept of a children's typing game being unintentionally horrifying, and that's barely even an aspect of the story. Mr. Mix is only presented in that light for the first paragraph, maybe, and after that, it becomes a generic gaming creepypasta. So, for that, I can't really say it's aged well at all. There is a good creepypasta in Mr. Mix, somewhere, but I don't think there's any way to get it without completely changing the story, and at that point, it wouldn't be Mr. Mix. Maybe someday someone will make an actually good version of this story, but until then, Mr. Mix will forever be one of the biggest cases of lost potential in a creepypasta. I'm going to say right out the gate, I'm not really sure what I think about this one. Misfortune.gb is easily the most generic creepypasta I'll be talking about in this video, aside from maybe Mr. Mix, and yet, it's not that bad. There are, of course, aspects of the story that I don't think work well, which is something I'll get into later, but for now, let's go over the story itself. Misfortune.gb is about a mysterious and obscure Game Boy game known as Misfortune, with no physical copies or ROMs of the game existing. Misfortune lacks any credits, leaving the creator of the game unknown, and the game itself seems to borrow assets from several other Game Boy games. Most notably, Pokemon Red and Link's Awakening. Despite all that though, those who have played the game claim it's one of the scariest games ever made, which is a bit of an overstatement, and you'll see why soon. The game starts with the player controlling a young boy in some sort of gothic building who encounters a malevolent, devil-like creature. The creature says, "I exist within the very fabric of reality. Do you want to challenge me?" And should the player say yes, the creature responds with, "Then let's begin." The rest of the game revolves around a series of maze-like puzzles, the most notable being one where the player must enter the correct cabin, as choosing wrong will cause misfortune to befall your loved ones. Should the player fail any of the levels, the game will cut to a black screen with the devil-like creature and text reading, "I am God here," in what appears to be bloody writing. The game is said to cause depression, and those who see the game over screen, with some people going so far as to take their own life. It's theorized in the creepypasta itself that the game's music is the cause of the side effects, similar to that of Lavender Town Syndrome. The creepypasta ends by detailing the death of the author's best friend, who the author believes was killed by the creature in the game. And that's Misfortune.gb. Much like all of the stories I've talked about so far, it is very short, but I think it still has just enough information to be intriguing. Now yes, there are some aspects that are a bit generic and less than stellar, like the game possibly killing people and the "I am God here" text box. But there's also some interesting ideas. One thing I didn't mention in the summary is that the game can only be found in certain copies of a few select Game Boy games. This is, in my opinion, quite an interesting concept, and I'm surprised it hasn't been used in any other creepypastas. Unfortunately though, this story is still pretty generic. It being generic isn't entirely bad, as it is overall well written, but it hardly feels believable given how many tropes it uses. There's a genuinely great concept here, and I hope somebody, someday, uses that concept to elevate the story to the level I know it could reach. Let's talk about a slightly longer creepypasta for a change. Killswitch is one of the more famous creepypastas on this list, though I'd hesitate to call it a creepypasta. Killswitch is, in some ways, similar to Polybius, in the sense that it's less a creepypasta and more of an urban legend. Before I get into the story itself, I'd like to go over where this story even came from in the first place. Killswitch originates from the now defunct blog Invisible Games, which was created by author Catherine M. Valente. The Invisible Games blog was a collection of fictional stories about non-existent video games, most notably Killswitch. The blog stopped being in use after 2007, but in 2013, Catherine would release The Melancholy of Mecha Girl, a short story collection, which too contained Killswitch. It's for this reason that I hesitate to call Killswitch a creepypasta, but at the same time, calling it a creepypasta isn't entirely inaccurate. But that's enough history. Let's get into the story itself. Killswitch, of course, is about a fictional game released in 1989, titled Killswitch. The game was released by the mysterious Czech company Karvina Corporation, and only 5,000 copies were created. The game was supposedly an early example of the survival horror genre, preceding many of its founding fathers, such as Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil, and Silent Hill, which Killswitch is directly compared to. The game started off with the player having to choose between one of two characters: Porto, a human woman, and Ghast, an invisible demon. This seemingly is the game's difficulty setting, as controlling a completely invisible character obviously makes the game harder. While Ghast can shoot fireballs and dispense poisonous gas, Porto's singular ability is to randomly change her size. The choice of character also impacts the plot of the game, though the creepypasta only details Porto's story, given that she's the default character. Porto was formerly a worker in a now abandoned coal mine, which she must now escape. Throughout the game, the plot becomes a not-so-subtle critique of the Soviet Union, specifically their industrial practices, and it's revealed that the dead workers that can be found throughout the game were killed by the governments rather than the demons, who are actually there to avenge the workers. The gameplay, as I said previously, is quite similar to survival horror games, though there is also a large focus on unraveling the mystery of the game's story, which is done by solving incredibly difficult puzzles. The game could be completed by consuming cocaine to control Porto's fluctuating size, before taking a previously found tape recorder to the end of the game, where the screen turns white and the game deletes itself. This is, by far, the most famous part of the story, and for good reason. The concept of a game that you can only play once because it deletes itself after you play it is incredibly intriguing. There have been plenty of games that I've wished I could play for the first time again, or feel that I can't replay, and Killswitch takes that idea to its most extreme conclusion. Back to the story, Killswitch deleting itself once you beat it, combined with the low amount of copies produced, of course, caused some outrage. This led to Karvina Corporation releasing a statement, which read as follows: Killswitch was designed to be a unique playing experience. Like reality, it is unrepeatable, unretrievable, and illogical. One might even say, ineffable. Death is final. Death is complete. The fates of Porto and her beloved Ghast are as unknowable as our own. It is the designer of Carvina Corporation that this be so, and we ask our customers to respect that desire. Rest assured, Carvina will continue to provide the highest quality of games to the West, and that Killswitch is merely one among our many wonders. These words drove players who still had a working copy to try to complete Gas's story, but to no avail. Eventually, in 2005, the copy, possibly the last in existence, was sold for $733,000 to Yamamoto Ryuichi, a Japanese man from Tokyo. Yamamoto, knowing his copy was likely the last in existence, decided to record his gameplay, so Killswitch could remain alive, in some form. However, none of his gameplay footage ever released, with the only recording of his being a 1 minute 45 second long video of Yamamoto at his computer, the player's select screen visible over his right shoulder. Yamamoto is crying. And that is the story of Killswitch. I believe that this is not just one of the best gaming creepypastas, but one of the best creepypastas ever created. Though, again, calling it a creepypasta isn't entirely accurate. Killswitch is a short story, first and foremost. Yes, it has creepypasta elements. Yes, it can absolutely still be considered a creepypasta. But compared to most creepypastas, it's far, far better. So, of course, Killswitch has aged well, even if it's not entirely fair to compare it to the rest of what I've talked about here tonight. Even though I did already summarize the entire story, I still highly recommend reading Killswitch for yourself. I've included a link to it, amongst all the other creepypastas I talk about in this video, in the description. I'm going to end this video off by talking about something that's not a creepypasta, but I'm not sure if I'll ever have the chance to talk about this again, so I think it fits well enough here. I'm going to preface this by saying, please do not look into playing this game. Of all of the creepypasta games I've talked about, Sad Satan is the most dangerous, since most versions of it contain malware, as well as real photos of gore, and in some cases, CP. And that does not stand for Club Penguin. Seriously, don't try to find a playable version of this game. It's not worth it. Sad Satan is a supposed dark web horror game, likely created in 2015, by someone who goes by ZK. However, this may not be the truth. The first records of the game's existence can be found on the YouTube channel Obscure Horror Corner, who uploaded a 5-part series of the game, though part 5 is now missing. Obscure Horror Corner wasn't a channel created for the sole purpose of uploading these videos, as the channel did upload videos of obscure horror games for a little over a year before uploading the Sad Satan videos. Now, I'm sure you can already guess, but it is very, very likely that Obscure Horror Corner created Sad Satan. Given that there's no records of the game's existence prior, Obscure Horror Corner's unpopularity before Sad Satan, and their disappearance afterwards, and finally, the fact that they never give a link to the game itself, something that will become a problem later, all points to the conclusion that Obscure Horror Corner made the game themselves. As for the game itself, Sad Satan is a walking sim, full of distorted, often monochrome, visuals, as well as audio consisting of distorted songs, like The Doors' Alabama song, and the song I Love Beijing Tiananmen, infamously used in Hong Kong '97, as well as audios of interviews with murderers, such as Charles Manson. Throughout the game, ghostly children can be found, though none of them do anything, and various images will flash on screen. These images range from unnerving photographs, photos of criminals, mostly those with a history of child abuse, some politicians like Margaret Thatcher and JFK, and some other miscellaneous images. Now, what about the darker imagery? That's actually not present in the version of the game uploaded to the Obscure Horror Corner channel, as those images are only present in clones of the game. I'll get to that soon. The game ends when the player comes across a child who damages them, and since there's no way to fight back, the game simply ends there. This is where Sad Satan gets interesting, because now, it's time to talk about the clones of the game. As I mentioned previously, Obscure Horror Corner didn't provide a link to the game when uploading the videos. This could be for a variety of reasons, as while we can assume Obscure Horror Corner created the game, that isn't known for sure. So, of course, with a game this strange and mysterious, people wanted to play it. This led to a download link to the game appearing on 4chan. However, this was not the original game. While incredibly similar, this version of the game contains slight differences in its layout, and of course, contained the illegal images and malware that I previously mentioned. Supposedly, you can find a safe version of this Sad Satan clone, but again, I don't recommend looking for it. Even if there is a safe way to play Sad Satan, the mystique around the game is far more interesting than the game itself. Most versions of the game, even if they don't contain any malware, often contain disturbing imagery just for the sake of being shocking, which I think is not only incredibly cheap, but also lame as hell. If you can't add any form of horror to your game aside from the most extreme form of shot content, that being photos of actual, real-life crimes, maybe you shouldn't be making a horror game. But I'm getting off topic. The release of this clone subsequently led to more clones of Sad Satan to be created, with many claiming to be the true version. But no true version can be found. We will never be able to play the original version of Sad Satan, unless Obscure Horror Corner decides to release it to the public. But until then, Sad Satan will remain unplayable, unless you want to risk downloading illegal images and malware to your computer. Despite the illegality of most versions of Sad Satan, I still find this game to be fascinating. The game is most likely bad, and I think the imagery used in the clones is absolutely detestable, but damn if the mystery around this game is intriguing. Sad Satan is one of the only genuine internet mysteries, and in an age where anything, even remotely mysterious, can get solved at any time, having a genuine, likely unsolvable mystery is a rarity. Sad Satan is not a creepypasta. It is not an ARG. It is not some weird art project. It's just a mysterious, unplayable game, and it's likely going to stay that way forever. And on that note, I think it's about time to end this video. There are, of course, more creepypastas I could have talked about, but if you couldn't tell by now, most creepypastas about fake video games have aged surprisingly well, and I'd rather not repeat that point over and over. Of course, some have aged better than others. For every Killswitch, there's a Mr. Mix. But even Mr. Mix has aged better than most of the stories I talked about last time. That isn't to say every creepypasta about a fake game has aged well. Far from it. While researching for this video, I found plenty of stinkers, but I think being a bit more positive for a change was nice. I would have included those stinkers, but none of them were really interesting enough to include. Anyway, I digress. Gaming creepypastas are usually not very good, but surprisingly, the ones I've covered here tonight were alright. Some I would even dare to say were good. If you found any of these creepypastas interesting, again, you can find links to all of them in the description. This brings me to my final point. The fact that these are gaming creepypastas. Creepypasta, as a medium, is no stranger to using other mediums to enhance their stories. Most creepypastas have at least an image to go along with them, and some stories like Ben Drowned and Most Lost Episode Creepypastas, have footage to further enhance the story and give credibility. Gaming creepypastas, though, whether they're based on existing property or not, have the advantage of video games. With enough time or effort, you could make the games described in these stories real, and if these creepypastas had games to go along with them, it would make them feel all the more real. This is part of why I think the stories I've talked about here today have aged especially well, as unlike, for example, sonic.exe, which was far too specific with its details and focused on pure shock value for its horror, something like The Theater could be a lot more real, given its mysterious and much more simplistic nature. I can find these stories, and therefore games, which focus more on atmosphere than shock value, much more believable. This does ultimately come down to personal preference. I generally prefer more atmospheric horror to in-your-face shock value, but I think most people would agree something like Killswitch would be far better, both in terms of horror and in terms of actual gameplay, than something along the lines of Sad Satan. But anyway, that's about all I have to say. I hope you enjoyed this look at gaming creepypastas, and if you did enjoy it, please do leave a like and subscribe for more videos like this one. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there, and good night.